Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson and I would like to welcome you to a continuation on something that I started to talk about in the previous week's show. And it has to deal with why we still have these disparities in um, America when it comes to race relations, and why we still have this divide. Before I continue, let me introduce the purpose of this show. For those of you who are new to the Emoji Circle, the purpose of the Emoji Circle is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. Even many people that look like, who are of African descent, get things confused, about who we are. And also, I believe here in the Emoji Circle, and I've been doing this for a considerable amount of time now, 24 years, that only through dialogue can there be a shift in consciousness. And also that I would like to add that, when we deal with the media or when we deal with other forms of communications around this country today, people tend, and those institutions tend to get things wrong at times, but also they tend to get things wrong deliberately, at times. And if we don't understand and know who we are as a individual or as a people, or the truth of this nation and what the history is, then we still won't heal the racial divide that still plagues us. I was talking to an individual in the control room, the producer, here earlier before this show, and on this topic. And I've been doing this show, as I said, 24 years, and dealing with people of African descent issues. And guess what? In 1995, when I first started the Umoja Circle, I was talking about the criminal justice system and the discrepancies and the disparities that it have between how black men are treated by the criminal justice system and how white Americans are treated. The issues that plague that we're still dealing with today, a la Colin Kaepernick and his silent protests that brought that issue to the forefront, or the issues of the Confederate flag or the Confederate statues that is a symbol to people that look like me of a time in which white supremacy was at its peak. And the destruction of the America that we now deal with and know was if the people who fought the military of the United States, the Federals, had their way, America would look more like Europe with various different countries that we call states all fighting each other. And look what happened for most of the first half of the 20th century. You had World War I and World War II, and the destruction almost of Europe, when you have all these different countries fighting each other and bringing almost the destruction not only of Europe but the whole planet. If the Nazis had gained, say, the nuclear bomb or something like that, this world would have been a wholly, totally fascist system. And in fact, fascism seems to be rearing its ugly head in this part of the 21st century. This isolation kind of mentality, this nationalistic type of consciousness, but what I'm saying is nothing new. There are those who have a message that is truthful, I must say, and there are those who have a message that are timely. Yet there are times that there are those who have a message that is not suited to the capacity of those who are not ready to hear it. See, people like Marcus Garvey was saying some of the things I'm saying, where did the people of the time have the capacity to to hear what he was saying. Some did, but it scared a whole lot of people. Honorable Malcolm X had a message about us as people of African descent doing for ourselves. Martin Luther King had a message that were truthful in context, in the framework of being Black in America, but those outside Black America were afraid and didn't want to hear his message. Some inside Black America did not want to hear what he had to say, or Marcus Garvey had to say, or what Malcolm had to say, okay? Regardless of how truthful they are in context of, from our perspective, that is truth. Not all truth is the same, unless you understand the context in which that truth is being said. But you must speak your truth fully and completely, okay? And we must live our truth, you know, so if we, you know, but you try to do it in a kind manner if you can, you know, but how many people are ready to hear that truth? That we must understand this. I would like to put a little quote up there for you to read that I think is very important, that you must understand. That race in America has always shaped America's concept of culture, democracy, economics, and citizenship. And Black Americans have been for hundreds of years confined by deliberate types of laws, along with social and economic policy, to separate zones of living, not being allowed to go where they choose or as true citizens. Regardless of, again, like I said in the previous show, regardless of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment of the Constitution and all the laws that came about, and civil rights laws that came about that were supposedly used to address those issues. You know, people don't realize that even though we have all these systems, that we're talking about political system, economic system, social system, which includes housing and education and health care, all these systems simply functions. It's up to each human being in that system to put our humanity into it, to make it function in a humane way or a not inhumane way. And it's how you think is what produces your actions. And your consistent actions becomes your behavior, and your consistent behavior becomes your character. So, and people don't understand that your actions, your behaviors, your ideas that is passed on through this thing called culture is what is passed on, the psychology that creates those actions, those ideas, and you know, and the ideas, I should say, that create those behaviors, creates the psychology that is passed down culturally. You know, what we do as Americans, say, compared to somebody from Japan who's built under that culture. There's a history. There are certain practices that makes a person Japanese or British or Irish that is passed on generationally. There's certain psychological, from the time you're a child, there's certain psychological conditions that you are conditioned to respond to, and that's passed on generationally. So like I've quoted before, we all carry the minds of those who've come before us. The foundation of every human being is the parents, is what they instill, or whatever adult has influence on a little child. There is a part of the brain, and I cannot remember the name of it, but I know it's a part of the brain that whatever new information that is given, that you ever heard before, especially as a child, you know, and is reinforced by the adults around you, that becomes your truth. Okay, and sometimes that truth runs into reality. Okay, white America has that issue. those truths, those ideas. People don't realize the power of the laws. From the earliest time of the 1600s, the earliest colonies, like, Jamestown, Virginia, or the Maryland colonies, or the Massachusetts colonies, there were certain ways that people interacted with people that looked like me or Native Americans. There were certain laws that were produced that said how somebody who was white would deal with somebody who looked like me at the time, if I was considered by law not free or enslaved. Because to me, there was no such group as slaves. There's no people. A name that you give a group of people, there must be a landmass that reflects that group. We call certain people Chinese. There's a landmass that's called China. We got certain people that we call Japanese. There's a landmass called Japan or Nippon. Okay, there's no Negro land. There's no colored land, but we will call that. But it shaped how we think. Laws are powerful things. How many of you stop at a red light? Were you born with that conditioned response? Many of you who have been, like me, driving for decades, we could be talking to somebody and instinctively just see red, we stop. Conditioned, unconsciously. And so if you have laws that says, oh, slave codes, this is how we're gonna treat people that look like me with this skin. We have a right to rape their women and don't get charged with rape. Talk to Jefferson, all right? We have a right to whip somebody who we're punishing. And oops, if we kill them, we don't have to get charged. It's called the Incidental Killing Act of 1669. Look it up. This was produced, I think, either Maryland or Virginia. But a lot of the spray, it didn't matter because once you get in one colony, it was spread out. There actually was laws that were said deliberately by the United States, or the embryonic United States, that said if you kill another human being that looked like me, they're justified by other laws that said you had the right to hold them in, forever under servitude. We didn't make these laws up, but what I'm trying to say is those laws based on race shaped how we looked at one group to the other. And those laws still have an effect on how the dominant group, white America, looks at people of African descent. It's not because that they are consciously doing it. There is what they call an implicit bias. An implicit bias is a thing that you've been learning since you were a little child, passed down from generation to generation. You learn from your grandparents, your parents, from their grandparents, from their great-grandparents, and those cultural, psychological ideas, whether you live in 1865 or 1965, 2005, you have certain racial ideas and perceptions produced by laws, behavioral patterns that were produced by laws that still exist to this day, that produced a group of people in the South called the Confederacy, and those ideas and traditions that were created and interpreted to justify slavery, because that was the cause of the Civil War. You can read their own justification for leaving the federal government. They said it right there in their justification for separation of the South from the Northern Territories. You can read, Tawney's in the Dred Scott decision, that we were not even going to be human beings, but property. and property does not have any right that any white male had the right to listen to. So when you pass down those type of lawful ideas generationally, even though those laws might have been overturned, but again, like I said before, the actions of a generation become the experience of that generation. And those experience and actions produce behaviors and ideas. And those behaviors and ideas become the history of the next generation. And that those ideas are passed down generation to generation to generation. They then become the culture of that group. And if white America established certain laws, certain behavioral patterns when it came to dealing with people that look like me, that was established hundreds of years ago. But after generations and generations and generations of those laws, it becomes the culture of a people. And there was a culture of domination. Racism is a power structure inculcated with a way of thinking. All human beings have their prejudices. All people, I have my prejudice. And I've noticed, I'm a baby boomer, and when I was growing up, there was a term called racism, but there was also a term that was normally used, called prejudices. And of course, everybody has prejudices. I could have prejudices to us. I think it was George H.W. Bush didn't like broccoli. And I'm sure he had prejudices against broccoli. It's an unconscious, non-logical way of thinking based on no facts, but just assumptions. That's all prejudice is, a bunch of assumptions. It could be mindless assumptions, not logical assumptions. It's just how you feel about a certain thing. It does no harm to another person, And black people have their prejudices, and they express their prejudice too about white Americans or whatever. Sometimes you might hear, okay? But I'll look you in the face and tell you that black America could never be racist, because a racist has as a part of a power structure, uses that prejudices, his prejudice, within that system. And that system that was structured for the dominant group for hundreds of years. The system that those colonial politicians created by law. Okay, the Casual Killing Act of 1669. That's where you can, again, in punishing a slave, you accidentally, killed that person that looked like me, you're not gonna get punished for murder. Because they created a law that produced a certain idea, that produced a certain behavioral pattern that was justified by the system, the political system and the criminal justice system that validated those behaviors. None of the people that were affected by it, like the blacks or Native Americans who might have been enslaved during that period of time, had no power to change that system at the time. That's racism. And you develop a certain way of looking at one group towards another group. Because inculcated in the word racism is the term race. And it produced a way of looking at your race, the power, and utilizing the power structure, economical system, the political system, the military system, the educational system. You have a power in that system to control another group. When in American history did black people or Native Americans have power to control the lives of white Americans? Politically, educationally, militarily, economically, healthcare, with housing. When did we direct where white Americans could live or where white Americans could go to school? or whether white Americans could carry guns. We had never had that. That is a racist ability to do that. Having prejudices. I could go on that same Fifth Avenue that our current president during his campaign said he could go out on Fifth Avenue, shoot anybody, and his people won't say anything. Okay, a black person like me could go out there and be prejudiced against white Americans and say all kinds of foul things, which I don't do, but if I did that, as they were walking by down Fifth Avenue, by the time they get to the corner, those words would have no effect on their lives. It wouldn't have no effect on whether they go to what school they go to, their homes, their salaries, whether they're going to be treated well in court. I could mouth all kinds of racist stuff, prejudicial stuff. Let me get me wrong. Prejudicial stuff. That's being prejudiced. Has no effect on their lives. But if I'm a system, if I'm part of a system and I use my prejudice to dictate, and I'll admit there's some people who might be in positions of power that look like me that use their prejudice in that little aspect. But to dominate a whole group, no. You could have certain biases and power within that, but I'm talking about in terms of racism is about a whole group of people, and using your positions and laws not to deal on an individual level. There's power dynamic with prejudices. I'll be the first to admit that. But I'm talking about dealing with a whole group of people, a city or a state or a whole country full of another group. And you use your power to control that group in one sweep, to affect their lives in one sweep. That's what racism is about versus prejudice. And somehow in the last 40 years, those terms got all mushed together. I even hear TV analysts talking about, mixing truly prejudicial acts and call it racist acts. Combining those two terms wrongly. I've always said sometimes the media get things wrong, sometimes the media get things wrong deliberately. So now we got this confused determination so that the people who are still in power, that's always been in power, usually white and male, who controls those communication systems, who controls the type of things that are being told to us on a daily basis through these media empires, are still controlling how we think. And once you control, again, how a person thinks, you will control how they behave. And how they behave will reinforce a negative cultural aspect of another particular group. And we got to understand these truths. Yes, race in America still affects America. We're so much in denial of that fact that race is it's the glue that holds America together, or the hypocrisy really of American exceptionalism. We haven't reached that yet. This has been, and those founding fathers taught us, this is an experiment, okay? Over 240 something years of an experiment that we're still dealing with. There's a lot of questions that we're still dealing today that they couldn't even answer back in 1789 when the Constitution was put together. We must understand that race in America must be dealt with. And I was talking about something in the last show that I think I want to reinforce again, bring about, is that there is a implicit bias in most people. And for what is an implicit bias? That's an unconscious bias that we've been absorbing in our unconscious mind from the time we were children. What we heard at the dinner table from our parents or grandparents, what we're talking about from the neighborhood that we grew up in, what is talked about from our college experiences. It's like walking through a fog and inhaling that fog. We're not even aware that we're taking in all that fog into our system, you know, in the form of water vapor. We just taking it in, and those unconscious biases uh, is part of our reality every day of our life, and some part of it always flares up. And another aspect of implicit bias that we must address also, people think that they might not be prejudiced towards, say, people that look like me. There's an implicit bias. Let me use the example of that. In other words, there's a connection with black men implicitly with criminal justice system. It's sort of like you look at peanut butter and jelly. If I tell anybody, even I don't eat peanut butter, but if somebody asks me to associate jelly with something, I have been conditioned from the time I was a child to associate jelly with peanut butter, because that's what I was conditioned to see in commercials or in movies, or in reading books about certain characters who as a child, or whatever the storyline is. That is an implicit bias that we have between peanut butter and jelly, even though they're two separate things and can have other different relationships, but we always connect peanut butter with jelly because we've been conditioned to. But because of movies and books and 100 years of dealing with the criminal justice systems as enslaved people, because once we left the plantation to run away to freedom, we were against the criminal justice system of the time. That law that conditioned white Americans to say, hey, he's supposed to stay as enslaved, and if he run away or she runs away, they're criminals. And that's how they were taught about in the newspapers when things were written about getting them back and slave catchers. So there's always been this bias between a black person and the criminal justice system. Just to give you an idea of why it's so ingrained in many people to look at me first in a negative way. And if we don't deal with these types of issues, our selective memory, when we talk about and discuss topics of race, our implicit bias after hundreds of years. This is 2019, the 400th anniversary of that slave ship entering Jamestown, Virginia. 400 years of this, implicit biases and a negative perspective when it comes to race in America. And if we don't address this and deal with those negative things, instead of only looking at the good things of America, we're gonna have issues still, unhealed wounds. So peace, hotep, bye-bye.